So I'll be discussing some decision biases that you might be aware of already in some degree, but I want to apply this to the context of social media, and specifically I will focus on overconfidence here. So before I came out here, I did a quick search online looking at how the, well, standard media treats social media. And what I found is, actually this is no longer surprising to most of you, I guess, is that the standard media credits social media with quite a bit of influence on, well, recent political outcomes at a global scale. So for instance, it's been credited for starting up the Arab Spring, in this example here on Wired, but also it's been credited for outcomes of the recent EU referendum in the UK, the recent presidential election in the United States, and current debates that are ongoing in the United States about a number of political debates. This has also been picked up in the scientific field, and you see that researchers from psychology and neuroscience are picking up on this and looking at social media as a potential data source in their studies. So it's becoming more and more important, and it's being credited with a lot of influence that it might have on our decision making. And so I was wondering what had happened, because basically, at its principle, social media is just a way for us to share our thoughts, maybe some pictures of our babies, with our friends. So what has happened in that it can influence us now, influence our decisions, and even influence decisions at a global scale and collectivistic decision making. And to answer this, I looked into decision biases. So there's actually quite a large literature already in behavioral economics and psychology that has looked into these kind of decision biases. And if you just do a quick search on Wikipedia, you find that there's over 150 cognitive biases that have been identified by these researchers. It's actually closer to 200. And these can influence the ways that we make decisions. Moreover, this work has been extremely well received in the scientific community. So there are 2 recent Nobel Prizes that have been awarded in the field of economics. One to Daniel Kahneman for his work on prospect theory. He identified, for instance, the decision bias of loss aversion and framing effects. And another one just last year to Richard Thaler for his work on bounded rationality, as well as starting the field of behavioral finance. So these decision biases are important in the field of science, but also how we make decisions when it comes to social media. And I want to focus on one decision bias for the rest of my talk, namely overconfidence. And to illustrate what overconfidence means to you, I just want to do a quick thought experiment. Just consider for yourself your own driving skills, and then have a good look around in the room and think about whether you think that you're better than 50% of the other drivers in this room. Now, I want you to answer this question privately. I don't ask you to raise your hands. But what's typically found in these kinds of experiments is that about 70%, up to 93%, and these are probably people, these are definitely people from the United States that are heavily overconfident there, answer this question that, yeah, sure, I'm better than the median. And that's statistically just not possible. So this cannot be true. So people are overconfident, and actually a large amount of people are overconfident. And when you then look at what experts say about overconfidence, for instance, Thaler and de Bont say, perhaps the most robust finding in the psychology of judgment is that people are overconfident. Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, says overconfidence is widespread, stubborn, and costly. And he actually dedicates almost a third of his book to the topic of overconfidence. And finally, Scott Plous, who is a social psychologist reviewing this psychology literature, says that there's no problem in judgment and decision-making that is more prevalent and more potentially catastrophic than overconfidence. But let's not simply rely on our experts here, because they are actually overconfident as well, and they have good reason to be so. Let's look briefly at some research that has looked into this in some detail. So there's some very good research from the field of economics, behavioral economics in particular, and they have focused on these guys here, traders. This is from the film The Wolf of Wall Street, and you can kind of see that he's really confident, this guy, right? So what's been shown is actually that financial investors that are overconfident trade way too much than they should be trading. So they're making incorrect predictions about where the stock market is going and then start exchanging their stocks at a rate that is too rapid, and that leads to economic losses for their firms. The same has been shown for entrepreneurs and CEOs. When they're too overconfident, they're too risky, They entered the market too readily, and this will lead to, well, actually dropout rates of companies that have entered the market 10 years down the road in the order of about 80%. And most of these companies fail. Now, probably even more concerning is that overconfidence can also lead to losses of health and life. So there's actually a special issue on overconfidence. So the entire journal was dedicated for that year to the topic of overconfidence in medical decision-making in 2008. And one of the things that studies found is that overconfident physicians will actually be more likely to misdiagnose a patient and then recommend treatments that will not heal the patient but are risky to the life of the patient. So this is not good news. But what's relevant for our discussion here is there's this recent study that got access to a very large data set, the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, or CCES. And this is actually a study that's done annually in the United States before the congressional elections, before and after the elections. And this is a survey that is given to subjects in which they're asked about a number of opinions that they might have. But there's a subset of this data set that the authors of this study had access to, which gave them information about the media use of participants, their level of overconfidence in a number of relevant domains, such as inflation rates, but also where they are on the ideological spectrum. So are they conservative versus liberal, and how conservative versus liberal are they? And then obviously, because it's done before and after the election, there's data on voter turnout here. And so what these researchers find is that the more media you use, the more overconfident you are in your statements about, or in your estimates of current political events. And this then in turn leads to ideological extremism. So the more overconfident you are, the more likely you are to be at the ends of the spectrum, the more extremely liberal versus the more extremely conservative these people were. And these are then exactly the types of people that will go and vote. They're highly motivated to vote. So these basically 4 relationships have been quite nicely demonstrated in this study, demonstrating to us that media use is one of the sources that leads to overconfidence, and overconfidence is one of the sources that then leads to ideological extremism. So I want to take a step back because I promised you to show you some neuroeconomic insights. And I want to show you that there's additional things about the social media environment that we have to consider that actually lead to or exacerbate these decision biases that we already have, including overconfidence. So what I want to argue is that social media generates a rewarding context. It's like a framing effect, if you're familiar with Kahnemann's work, that leads to even further overconfidence. And so this is one of the main insights that the field of neuroeconomics has contributed to science in the recent past. This is what's called the valuation system, and the image that I'm showing you there is taken from a meta-analysis, so that is an analysis of over 206 neuroimaging studies, and it's showing a system that we now know is intimately involved in evaluating the costs and benefits of our actions. So it's really the thing that supports our decision-making. Just to give you an idea, this is the ventral striatum, this is the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. I'm just throwing this out there. You should be aware of these terms because sometimes they're mentioned in the press. Another thing that the system does is it's intimately involved in motivating our behavior and shaping habits. And so this has actually been elegantly demonstrated already in the 1950s by a study by Olsen Milner. And what these people did, what these researchers did, is they implanted an electrode into the brain of their rat subjects, their participants, and they sent down an amplitude, an electrical stimulation into the brains of these people, not people, they're rats, and then trained these animals to push a button, called a lever in this case, for this stimulation. And what they found is that animals would readily learn this. They would start pressing the button to receive the stimulation. They would start doing this at rates of 1,000 times per hour. They would do this up until exhaustion, basically until they passed out. And they would prefer pushing this lever to receive the stimulation over eating food even when they're hungry, leading to starvation. So this is basically a wonderful demonstration of when you activate the system, you can generate addictions in a way. Now, what social neuroscience has shown us recently is that social rewards, so when we seek reputation, which is one of the things that we do when we go out to social media, right? We want other people to think well of us when we repost and share their posts. It's processed in this very same brain system that generates these habits and motivates behavior. And this has been elegantly demonstrated by a study by Izuma et al. In Neuron in 2008. And what they did with their subject is they invited them into the lab and asked them to record a video of 1 minute introducing themselves to some other person. So they have to talk about themselves. Then they asked them to fill out a large array of personality questionnaires. And then they told their subjects, well, this is going to be evaluated by a panel of people that you don't know, and you will get the feedback about the evaluation, or this very personal evaluation about themselves, in the scanner when you come back to our lab next week. And so what they found is that, well, these social rewards are actually processed in exactly the same brain region. This here, again, is the ventral striatum, and you see that social rewards, so when you get positive feedback about your person, such as is illustrated here, this person thinks that the person in the scanner is trustworthy, then the brain responds in the exact same way that it does to monetary rewards or things that we care deeply about that had been demonstrated in the literature before to be processed by the system, and that had led to the picture I had shown you before. So social rewards are processed in this very same brain system that shapes our behavior. And there's an additional thing that I want to mention about social media, the social media environment, which is that it is basically framed in a very positive way. So there's a number of things that are only possible there. It's heavily biased towards positive social feedback, so the kind of reward seeking that this previous study had investigated. Only likes and shares are possible, and there's a lack of immediate negative feedback when you interact with people in this sort of minimalistic social environment that social media offers, such as Twitter or Facebook. And this is something that we have when we have person-to-person interactions, right? We get immediate feedback from, gestures or facial expressions of people that we interact with, and that makes us probably more careful about the things that we say to them. So this kind of negative feedback is missing in social media. And we show that this is a factor that can significantly enhance overconfidence, the fact that we are in this positive frame. In a recent study that I want to show you just really briefly, so this is an experiment. It's a very common task in the field of neuroscience. It's called a reinforcement learning task. And basically what subjects have to do is they have to learn whether these stimuli are good or bad. And one of them is always better than the other stimulus. These are basically meaningless symbols, and the subject selects one of them and then learns through this outcome here whether it leads to a positive outcome, such as in this case a gain of 50 cents, or a negative outcome, such as a loss of 50 cents. And the subjects learn this very readily, as you can see here. This is their performance, and as the experiment progresses, subjects get better at picking good stimuli and at avoiding to pick bad stimuli. But one of the things that we did in this very simple experiment is we also asked subjects about how confident they are about their decisions. And what we find is that in a gain frame, so when they're making decisions when only monetary rewards, so positive outcomes are possible, we find this significant overconfidence that I'm showing you here relative to when only losses are possible. And I want to argue that this is one of the things that happens in social media, that this positive frame leads to overconfidence. There's additional choice biases that are exacerbated by social media environments, namely the fact that we interact mostly with our friends or people that think like us. And this leads to what has been called in the literature echo chambers. So this is basically, we're exposed to one-sided information in there, and this is nicely illustrated by this study by Brady et al. From PNAS. They used Twitter data, and they looked at how information is exchanged within two networks. And in the blue, you see people that would rate themselves as liberal. In the red, you see people that would rate themselves as conservative. And you can see that each dot here, which is one person within this network, and a line is a reshare or a retweet of a message, that there's a lot of communication within these networks. So lots of reshares within the blue network and lots of reshares within the red network, but not much communication across these two networks. So this leads to highly correlated or one-sided information that we're exposed to in these social media environments. And this is actually made even worse by these newsfeed algorithms by Facebook and Twitter, who will show to us information that we had liked or shared before, leading to further sort of, one-sided information. Now, there's two additional biases. One is called correlational neglect. And that is, people are unaware of the fact that they're exposed to these correlated, one-sided kinds of information. So when they get evidence for something they already believe in, they tend to overweight this kind of evidence. And they almost rarely get evidence for the opposite side because of these two biases that I told you about. Okay, so to summarize what I've said is, social media basically leads to overconfidence via a number of decision biases that this kind of context enhances. One of them is that it's a rewarding context, and I had shown you in a study that a rewarding or a positive frame leads to overconfidence. Another one is that we're exposed to correlated signals, and one that I haven't talked about so much is that these signals are typically highly salient because there's a lot of emotional information exchanged on social media, and that's exactly the kind of information that captures our attention. This then leads to overconfidence, which in turn can enhance ideological extremism, as shown by a study that I had talked to you about before, which then influences how we make decisions. So this is the cascade of how social media leads to overconfidence, leads to this, and influences our decisions that I have talked about. I thought about a number of interventions to reduce this overconfidence and these decision biases in a social media context. And one of the things that I think is critical is to start teaching our children that are being exposed to these social media contexts a number of metacognitive skills. And what I mean by that is just simply tell them about the decision biases that could influence the way they make decisions that have been identified in the literature now over the past 50 years. It's also important to teach statistical literacy, because another decision bias is for us to maintain cognitive ease, and if we don't know how to deal with numbers well, then we're kind of hesitant to engage with factual information and statistical information. And if we teach this to our children, then it would overcome this sort of cognitive barrier that we have. Now, a couple of open questions still remain. So I believe that the framing of the social media environment is distorted at the moment, but could we maybe decrease overconfidence if there is also a possibility for negative feedback and reputation loss, such as a dislike button or something like that? And if we interacted across our networks, would that decrease overconfidence? So if we're exposed to information that is not so one-sided, not so correlated, but also information from other networks to give us an alternative viewpoint. Okay, so this is where I want to close. Obviously, there's many open questions here, and this is something that needs to be researched much more closely. Thank you very much for your attention.